Hello and welcome to this lecture series on the Industrial Revolution. We're going to begin with the industrialization debate. Now, though most PR is going to give you an opposite impression, I am going to put forth out to you the theory, or at least the side of the debate, that the Industrial Revolution was one of the most profound events in human history. Matter of fact, the most profound since the Neolithic age and the beginning of agrarianism 12,000 years ago, and that it's resulted in a society that is by and large safer, able to support larger populations, and also granting the longest life expectancy ever heard of. Beginning in the early 1700s in central England, industrious groups of men began to experiment with business and manufacturing processes. They began to take a look at how can we make these things more efficient, how can we make them more profitable. Their advances began in the woolen and cotton industries, but quickly then spread to things like pottery, coal, iron making, and eventually transportation, other industries, right? The insight was that if you could make them more quickly and more efficiently, and if you could develop new ways to transport them, you can completely transform the markets and how they're traded, okay? This, of course, ultimately leads to new ideas on how society should be formulated, right? It creates a new era of critical thinking. Okay, industrialization actually depends on the idea that traditional thought should not always be used to constrain us, right? That we should not be held back by the old ways of thinking. Okay, matter of fact, it's through careful thought and consideration of what our ancestors did, we can develop new techniques and new approaches, right? Now, in industrialization, you're going to have always, in this case, winners and losers, right? Each time a technology makes something obsolete, some people are going to lose their livelihood. But by and large, it's also going to create new opportunities. So the overall effect of industrialization is rather liberating. Matter of fact, democracy correlates very strongly with industrialization. So does the presence of mass literacy, widespread higher education, and even advancements in human rights. Now, you'll notice this seemingly glowing picture I've painted of industrialization is running in stark contrast of the normal perceptions that we have on it. That's really driven by three major factors. First of all, humans in general have an incredible depth of ingratitude. We're really good at taking things for granted. Most of us don't think about the debt we owe to the industrial process, right? For example, electricity. Right? Pretty much everyone that I know, and I can't think of a single person, was born and raised in societies in which you had electrification. And you take electricity for granted. You know, your expectation is that when you turn the light switch on, that the light does indeed turn on, right? And the only time that you really notice the importance of electricity is when you don't have it, when the power goes out, right? Today, we could probably make the argument about things like this, right? Technologies like the cell phones and the internet, like what we're using here. Again, we begin to take it for granted. I remember when I first moved to Texas, I didn't have a smartphone. I used to get around Texas using one of those fold-out maps, right? Nowadays, you wouldn't even think about it. You type your destination in. Well, what happens, though, if you were to lose this, right? Those of you who've lost your phone and tried to navigate someplace probably know exactly what I'm talking about. Secondly, we have a tendency to think more towards the future than the past. Right? We always think about what kind of advancements. I mean, we have an expectation of obsolescence nowadays. We expect the next phone to get better. We expect the next game console, the PS5 or whatever it may be, to be something better than the past. And when we do look to the past, we have a tendency to look at it with a sense of false nostalgia, right? We daydream about, a simpler time, the good old days. Ah, yes, the good old days when all of us worked on farms and most of our kids died before they were 6, right? And third reason why there's a lot of negative connotation to the Industrial Revolution is that there is aspects of it that are easy to dislike, right? For example, you've got you have the tradition of the industrialists themselves, right? You got those early industrialists who rose to power often through very ruthless means, right? John D. Rockefeller was a pioneer in the American oil industry, right? But his tactics were absolutely ruthless. Matter of fact, he became so self-conscious of his own image that in the later stage of his life, he worked very hard to reinvent himself, gave away most of his wealth. He was noted for everyone he would meet in his older age, he would give a dime to. He'd hand them a dime because he could always spare a dime, right? And it almost became kind of a gimmick of his, right? Of course, industry creates a lot of the environmental problems that we face today, right? Things like in this picture here, you see that's the Cuyahoga River on fire. That's America for you. We set a river on fire. You know, the amounts of pollution that could be created, especially in the early stages of industrialization. Ironically, it's the way that this has been addressed is through more industrialization. You're going to find that the nations that are doing better at addressing the environmental issues and the impact of industrialization are the wealthier nations, the ones that can do more about it, right? So they fight industrialization with more industrialization. And then finally, of course, the Industrial Revolution made warfare absolutely horrific, right? Alfred Nobel invented TNT with the belief that, oh, it's going to make warfare too terrible to endure. He finds out how very wrong he is, right? And he actually creates the Nobel Peace Prize to try and make his legacy tied to something else. And then we move forward, of course, now we have weapons of mass destruction that are capable of destroying whole cities and wiping out all life on Earth. So there's aspects of it that are actually rather abhorrent. So it might seem paradoxical to embrace a process that shattered traditional ways of life, increased economic inequality, exploited workers, had an impact on the environment, and exponentially increased the horrors of war, but we should do just that, right? When we take a look at this historically, people in traditional societies pre-industrial revolution were pretty powerless. From the hunter-gathering through the peasant stage, if you were born in the lower classes of society, that's pretty much where you were going to stay, right? You were devoid of choice, right? Today we tell our children you can grow up to be whatever you want. And while that may be an optimistic statement, at least the opportunities exist for them to strive for that. This is something that wasn't true in traditional pre-industrial societies. If you told them that, it would be a lie, right? The inequality through industrial societies is real, right? There is a one percenter, if you will, if you want to use that terminology, right? But the poorest of the poor in industrialized societies do far better than the poorest and poor in non-industrialized ones, right? You have a richer poor. I know that's a pretty callous thing to say, but when you take a look at some nations where their poorest, their biggest concern is finding clean water, you don't really see that to that degree at all here in the United States amongst its poorest of the poor, right? One of the reasons why is the industrialists themselves realized you got to have your poor at least prosperous enough to buy your product, right? Henry Ford is a good example of this, right? He paid his auto workers $5 a day. This was compared to $2.40 a day on an average auto worker, maybe even low as $1.50 a day, right? And why do you do that? Well, because then they can afford to buy your product, right? Of course, the environmental impact of industrialization, especially in the early phases, were pretty profound, right? Rivers in Britain and America were horrible. They were almost open sewers with human waste and industrial pollutants, okay? But it's not really as true today, right? Rivers in Britain and America are comparably cleaner than they were half a century ago even, right? There's been an effort to do that. And like I said before, the more industrialized the nation, the more readily they can clean things up as well, right? You use industry to handle the issue of industrial pollution, okay? And finally, when it comes to war, the one thing that stands out strikingly, especially in the post-World War II era, is that violence is, as far as large-scale violence, is far less common than it used to be, right? I mean, it used to be, if you take a look at, like I said, the 100 years of peace between 1815 and World War I, that time period in Europe that I refer to as 100 years of peace-ish, there are at least 12 different conflicts that took place in that time frame. We had in the first half of the 20th century 2 global wars that killed millions of people. But in the post World War II era, you'll notice that we're not having these large conflicts anymore. You have the rise of mass education, encourages people to be more disciplined, more reasonable, and more restrained, right? These kind of things in industrial societies tend to lead, it's not industrially profitable for you to be at war with each other. So these things will lend towards actually ultimately a more peaceful planet.